Okay, I'd like to introduce, first of all, Dave Bodley, who is with the Salish Nanaimo Indigenous tribe in Nanaimo, and he is going to do a traditional welcome.
Good afternoon, welcome. As you're saying, my name is Dave Bodley. I'm from Nanaimo First Nation. But I always, in part of our culture, we always like to ask if there's anyone that might recognize that they might be of First Nations, Métis, or Inuit ancestry. Do you know what, brother? Métis. Métis, welcome.
And one name.
Yes, part of our family. Yeah, wonderful. In our culture, we say, welcome to our territory. As a knowledge keeper myself, part of our way of recognizing that we're thankful to be at a gathering is you bring your hands in front of you with your thumbs outwards and you shake it twice when you say, Haishka CM. CM. That means thank you, teacher, or thank you, respected one. In our culture, it's important to use the hand symbol more so than just the So I'm going to sing only one verse of the song today, but instead of clapping, it's the hand signal at the end of it. And that's something important we say. We always want people to just recognize that we're here in the now, we're in the present of being now and starting in a good way. Place both of your feet on the floor. Check that our cell phones might be on vibrate, making sure that we don't receive phone calls. Someone said, no one ever calls me. Well, that's a call when they were trying to be silent. And one, I was sharing earlier, one lady said, I have a question, and her phone rang at the same time. What, she had a question? And she said, but I have a question. Well, don't yell at me, it's your phone ringing. But it was just about being present. And that's something important in any gathering. And we say in doing it in a good way. And this is part of it. So. Yo, Ole, hola, yo, ole, hola, ya, ole, ya, ole, hola, ah, ole, ole. In our cultural way, it's always important when I recognize that people come from other nations sometimes too, and the islanders that are here, we had a very sacred past we had for this island, including the closest village we had right across from the water here was very important to us. And so I'm honored anytime I get to come to a gathering just to share a little bit. My traditional name is Lahea, and I come from the Johnny family from Nanaimo. So we have a lot of connections to all the people of Nanaimo. So in a good way, Siam, thank you for being here in this gathering. Where the words are, we're so honored that you're able to be here. We're so honored, we're so thankful that you're able to be in our celebration today. So I'll turn it back over to you. Okay, good. As a recognition, we call this a traditional handshake. Now we can hug each other when you need to. Thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Hi. Welcome again to our Lions Sunday Speaker Series. Welcome also to the Zoom people. And we hope that you can hear us well this year. We know we had a little bit of a problem last year with that, but we hope that's remedied. However, if you do have a problem, let us know in the chat box and we'll fix it right away. Emily will fix it. It's with great appreciation that we, the residents of Protection Island, acknowledge this land as the unceded territory of the Nanaimo First Nation and their legacy throughout the island. Thanks to Rick for coming early and setting up the chairs. Thanks, Emily, for doing the Zoom setup again. Donations this week from the coffee service will go to the museum. This talk is being recorded for future listening if anyone has the desire to do so. Questions are at the end of the talk, unless you have something absolutely totally important and pressing, then you can raise your hand. Zoomers, use the chat box or raise your hand so we can see it. And please mute yourself, otherwise Zoomers. And now I'd like to introduce our speaker, Liz Hammond-Kaarremaa, who most of you know. However, the new islanders may not know her that well. She's been on the island for 34 years. Her sister Kathy and Tano and family also live here. And her mom and dad, Gary and Dodie, maintained a second home here for many years. This I did not know. Liz was born in Germany. Her dad was in the military there. So she's lived in many exciting places over the years. She's lived in England, Germany once again. They went back to Germany. Later, Ontario, Manitoba, and Victoria. There in Victoria, she met her husband, Mark, a photographer, and they settled on PI. Liz received a master's in educational technology at Royal Roads, and then worked at VIU as director of research and manager of technology, where she taught the faculty how to use technology to their advantage. Liz retired from VIU 8 years ago. About 20 to 30 years ago, Liz took an interest in spinning and signed up for a 7-year course at Olds College in Olds, Alberta. What happened was they would spend 1 week at the college per year, and then the other 51 weeks they would come home and work on projects, and then they'd go back for the second weekend. And the ultimate goal was that you would become a master spinner. And so there we have a master spinner. There she became fascinated by the Coast Salish Woolly Dogs and the use of their fur in spinning. These wonderful Indigenous dogs died out between the 1850s and the 1900s, roughly. But however, a blanket of this dog fur was discovered by Liz and is now in the Smithsonian in Washington. Liz will discuss DNA of the woolly dogs. The A stands for ancient. And so please welcome Liz Hammond-Kaarremaa.
Thank you. We'll just switch to tab 2. Oh, so.
But thank you now. Oh, you're welcome. Do you want me to sit somewhere else?
Right. But first of all, I want to raise my hands to Dave and Sue and a few other people like Emily and the Lions Club for organizing this. So hi.
Are you ready for your presentation now?
Sure. Okay. And that reminded me that I am a spinner, and I did remember to put a few things in my bag. So afterwards you can have a look at this. This is mountain goat spun on a traditional spindle from 80 to 90 years ago, and this is Samoyed dog bear that I spun, I don't know, probably 20 years ago, but. And I did it in the traditional style that the Sanemos or Coast Salish Peoples got sent to. I dropped. Yeah, and I might search those later, but you can. So, RCM, CA, Height, thank you for coming out. And I'm going to talk, it'll be 40, 45 minutes about the Coast Salish Woolly Dog. And I'm going to point to Emily every time I need a slide change. So that's what I'll be doing. And I want to give you a little bit of history about the Coast Salish Woolly Dog and also talk about a research project that I was involved with recently. And this is the spindle whorl on the left. With the hole in the mouth is where you put the actual spindle. And that's what was used for making the very thick wool. That's the size. And that's the Sanema logo, isn't it? Yeah. Okay. Oops.
There we go.
Okay, I wanted to show you a few blankets before we get in talking about the wool dog. On the top left, this is at the Perth in Scotland Museum, and they have a blanket that was collected in 1823. So that means that blanket is older than 1823. So it's one of the oldest. There's only one other, I think that's older, that we know of. And that's a geometric style Coast Salish blanket. And I'm examining it. I look very closely at the wool and how it was spun. And on the right is a blanket that was worn in 1905 when a few chiefs, Coast Salish chiefs, went to visit King George and asked him to take a look at the unfairness of the lack of treaties. And then there was treaties, like here in Nanaimo, and there was 12 on the island, and that were not being adhered to. And it was woven by I think she was a Powhatan woman that married a Musqueam, or the other way around, I can't remember. And in the lower left, those two blankets are at the Pitt Rivers Museum in Oxford. And this one is on a small loom. And it's probably a loom that somebody is using that they're learning on before they go to the big looms. When I look at that, it's got a bit of a halo. And if you look at this dog here, it's got a bit of a halo. So I think that one should be tested just to see if it is dog hair. And on the left is one that is in Nanaimo, and Violet Elliott, who she's married a Cowichan man, but she's from Sanemook. Her great-grandmother wove on a 12-foot long loom at the Partridge Bay in one of the longhouses. It would take 3 of them to weave that width there. And we know that blanket came from Nanaimo. She was very excited because it could be a blanket that her great-grandmother wove. Okay. And I want to give a shout out to Jean Compton, who helps with this this map. And what you've seen there is the pinkish area is where mountain goats were found. And they were found, they would actually come all the way down to the Fraser River, depending on the time of year. Nowadays, you find them far away and up higher. But you'll notice there's no pink on the island, and there's no pink on the Olympic Peninsula. So there was no mountain goats in those areas. And so a mountain goat was the only fiber from a mammal that you can use to spin. But the Coast Salish people that are mainly in the yellow area, but it goes up to Comox too, had to raise wool dogs to get a fiber that they could use for their blankets. So the wool dogs were very much concentrated in the Puget Sound, Salish Sea, Lower Vancouver Island area. Okay, they started to die out in the 1850s, might have existed in the early 1900s, a few here and there. But there was one pelt that was forgotten about. It was collected in 1859 and shipped to the Smithsonian. I'll give you a little bit more of history. But the dog's name was Mutton. He was owned by a white man. And so his pelt is in the museum. It was rediscovered about 20 years ago. So it was the oh, you can't see us. Can you move the screen to maybe to the left? There, now you can see George. Okay, this is George Gibbs, and he fascinating fellow. He was hired. He was trained as a lawyer as a young man on the East Coast, and he got excited about the California gold rush, and he wanted to have a bit more adventure in his life. So he ended up in California. He worked with some treaties down there. It ended up being hired by the US government to be part of the 49th border survey. So they had already established where the border was going to be, but they had to survey it. So he was part of the team that did that. He was hired as a geologist, so he also was looking at things relating to rocks, but he also was a linguist. So he wrote most of the Coast Salish and coastal dictionaries, the first ones. And so anytime he met somebody, he would quiz them, well, what's beyond that mountain and what's up the river and what's the word for this. And he was very, very inquisitive, and he wrote a lot of this down and wrote a lot of reports that are very important nowadays. So this map on the lower right is showing the border, and the stars are places that he was camped at to do the border survey. And he just before he started, or I guess he had started, but they hadn't gone out to the 49th parallel to start working yet. He actually came to Nanaimo. So I'm going to digress a little bit and tell you a bit more about him because it relates to us. Okay, so he came here, and he came with James Madison Alden, who was an artist. And he came to look at the coal mines on Newcastle Island because he was a geologist. But they did a few other things while they were here. September 16th, 1857, they went up the river, and he wrote about it. He wrote about seeing some of the grave areas and some of the carvings there. And he wrote down one of the origin stories that he was told when he was up there. And he might have been, probably was, with James Madison Alden here, right out here on Gallows Point, looking over towards Nanaimo. You can just see the bastion right there. And the bastion's moved from its original location. But so Madison Alden painted this painting from this point here, looking towards Nanaimo. Okay. And he also did a painting looking the other way. So this is the Squaquemi village. And Elliot White, his grandparents lived on the island at Allison and Kim's house. And Elliot's father is Doug White from the Nanaimo. And I interviewed him as part of my research, and this is what he says about this area. Oops. You might have to click right on the go back one more slide, or read on the sound thing. Yeah.
Squeak me. Yeah, and so that means little dogs, and so what that says to me exactly is that Cameron Island was one of the dog sanctuary islands, and it lines up exactly with the rest of the history of Nanaimo, because downtown Nanaimo is built on top of what used to be the Xalapul, which was the home of the Xalapkan people, and the Xalapkan were the highest ranking and the wealthiest group in Nanaimo, or the different groups that came together to become Nanaimo under the Indian Act. And so that group had the rights to the largest fishing weir right at the mouth of the river, and they were the only ones who didn't spend their winter in Departure Bay because they had they had their own site. And so the Cameron Island, which is right adjacent downtown where the village was, being a dog island, it just makes perfect sense because it was just right there, and it all lines up. Willie Good shared this with me about how the name also comes from a rock that used to be somewhere near where Port Place Mall is now in Nanaimo, which is right by Cameron Island. It was a giant stone wool dog. Yeah. Yeah. And so there was at some point, and so this area is really significant. This whole, the waterfront where the Nanaimo River is, but also especially the Newcastle Channel. These are all really significant places in our history where Chales was known to walk, and where Chales had turned a large number of different animals into stone along the shore. So I've known that there's different stone animals along the channel between Nanaimo and Sasechan. And so there being a stone wool dog down towards Cameron Island makes perfect sense as well. And so I guess it's gone now. But it was somewhere near where the Port Place Mall with London Drugs was.
Also hired as part of the survey crew was Dr. Caleb Kennerly, and he was 28 when he started with this, and he had gone to school on East Coast to train as a doctor, and one of his teachers was Spencer Baird, who became the first director or curator of the National Museum, the Smithsonian. And Baird had arranged for him to become the doctor on the survey team. And when he wasn't doctoring, because there wasn't a lot of doctoring to do, he was tasked with collecting specimens and sending those specimens to the Smithsonian, to Baird. And we have a letter from August the 29th, 1859, where he says, let's see if I can read it from here. Somebody got a mountain goat and shipped it to George Gibbs, who was at Skagit, Camp Skagit at the time. And most unfortunately, his Indian dog, Mutton, went at it and ate the head off. He shipped it to me yesterday, and I can't quite read because of the glare, but he shipped it to him yesterday, and he said, you could imagine my dismay when I opened it up to find out the damage that Mutton had done. And then he goes on to say, Mutton is a Coast Salish Woolly Dog. And so that's how we know Mutton is a wool dog. And then he goes on and says, Mutton has been recently sheared, and as soon as his hair grows out, we'll make a specimen of him. So we don't know if he killed the dog intentionally because of this havoc, or whether he was joking because Spencer Baird was a good friend of his. Okay, so next. So when they discovered the Mutton was there, and it was Candace Wellman from Bellingham, and she was researching the stories of some Indigenous women who married some of the first people, white people that were in the area. And one of them was Dr. Kennerly. And Dr. Kennerly married Cecilia, a woman in Semiahoo area, which is near Blaine, and had a son with her. And so she went to Washington to research Dr. Kennerly, and went through all his notes and copied them, and came back out here, and she had read this letter, and so she knew about woolly dogs, and she was kind of curious about them. So anytime she saw something about woolly dogs, she'd read it. So Susan Crockford, who Jane knows from UVic, wrote a very important report back in mid-1990s about some bones. She had gone through old dog bones, and she classified them as two types. The smaller type she was suggesting was woolly dogs, and the bigger ones were village dogs or hunting dogs. And she said, of course, we can't be sure because there is nobody collected a wool dog. There's no museum with any wool dogs. And Candace went to bed that night. She woke up in the middle of the night saying, yes, there is. And she dug out the letter, got on the phone the next day, or email next day, to the curator and said, where's Mutton? And he said, well, we've lost his paperwork. If we knew what number he was given, we could positively identify him. And so she went back and found another letter in return to Kennerly saying, we've given him number 406. And so she back on the phone to him this time, and he said, I'll go out to our storage area and look. And sure enough, he found Mutton. So that's how Mutton was rediscovered. And she's so pleased because here, she says, here am I, just a housewife and an amateur artist. None of the researchers found this out. Anyway, so that meant that there was a Coast Salish wool specimen that in one of the museums at least. Anyway, go 20 years later, and this article came out of Hakai magazine, great magazine. It's only online, but she was, Audrey had gotten a postdoc fellowship and she was working at the Smithsonian when COVID hit, and she couldn't get access to the specimens. And what she wanted to do, she's Andrew will be interested in this, she's a virologist and likes to look at the evolution of viruses and how that changes humans' immunity, and they both evolve back and forth. And so she was going to collect specimens, DNA specimens from birds that were collected before 1918, and take a look at their DNA and see any changes. But she couldn't get access to all the specimens because they were in lockdown. So she was at home one day reading, and she read the Hackeye magazine. And she had studied at the University of Oxford under a fellow that looked at genomics of dogs. And she read this article and was fascinated by it. And the article mentioned that I had found a wool dog blanket. It's not at the Smithsonian, it's at the Park Museum in Seattle. Anyway, so she reached out to me and she said, look, I want to, well, first of all, sorry, she went to see Logan, who was her colleague and supervisor for this project, and said, can I switch my project to look at the DNA of Mutton? And he said, Mutton? Who's Mutton? So she told him about Mutton, and he said, sounds great. So they reached out to me and they asked me if I would be involved. And I said, of course, because I had actually tried to get another fellow to do the DNA, and he started on it. He extracted some DNA. He's in Australia, but then he lost his PhD student that was keen, and somehow it just never got done. So I was thrilled when they contacted me. And next slide. And so what they were very keen on was doing what we call a two-eyed approach to the research. So they wanted to bring the Coast Salish voices into the research itself. So we tried to have the science and the oral history combined. Okay, next one. So they wanted to merge Western science with Indigenous knowledge. And the goals were to look at the ancient DNA of Mutton and also a village dog. So they found another dog, it's sharing the same drawer as Mutton, and he had been collected from Semiahmoo as well, from Blaine, the year before. So they had two dogs from the same geographic area and from the same era to compare each with. But they had to do it in a culturally appropriate way. And they also wanted to know how to share the information. So those were the main goals. And my role was to bring Coast Salish voices to the project. So I said, well, before you even take the DNA, let's check with Stephen Point, and that's Stephen Point on the right, and his wife, Gwen. And Stephen and Gwen are from the Stalo area, the Fraser River, Chilliwack area. And we know that Mutton was acquired there. And we don't know that Mutton was born there, but he was acquired because it said from the Chilliwack Indians. So that was, I thought that was a good place to start. He was also Lieutenant Governor of BC and the Chancellor at UBC, a lawyer, a judge. And at one point, or I guess he's still considered Grand Chief of the Stalo Nation. So that seemed like a good point to start. So I started with them, and they were very happy that this research go ahead, as long as they would be able to get the results of the research. And so we started with their blessing, and then I formed an advisory committee of people from north and south of the border, because Coast Salish goes all the way down Puget Sound, and weavers, knowledge keepers, elders, people that had expressed a deep interest in Coast Salish wool dogs. And then I interviewed 7 people that had memories, stories, or concerns about how the woolly dog story is portrayed. And, I forgot to say, so there's Stephen, there's Gwen, and there's my brother holding the umbrella. That was his job. Okay, next slide. So, so we started in spring of 2021, and COVID was still going on. So we did most of our meetings by Zoom until things lightened up and we could get out and meet each other. So on the top left is a Zoom meeting where we met with that's Missy, and she's the curator of mammals at the Smithsonian, And right in front of her is Mutton's pelt, and behind her is the Indian dog. We gave him a name. I can't remember what it was called. Is the Indian dog, and on the far left, you could see them lying on tables side by side. And then we were just zooming, and then there's Logan and Audrey in the background. So we're learning together as a group. And then when things loosened up, when we actually did a field trip to the Burke Museum and had a good look at this blanket, which is mostly dog wool. It was collected in 1899, so we know it's older than that. And it's got elk or deer sinew in the warp. So made with very traditional means, but it was also very different to a lot of the Coast Salish weavings. So that's us in one of the rooms at the Burke Museum. So the group helped design the questions, and we learned all sorts of things about the dog together. We also saw at the Burke Museum this basket, which is a Skokomish basket there down at the very far ends of Puget Sound. And this is a typical Skokomish basket because they often have a rim with dogs on it or wolves, because wolves was very important in their culture. And if the dog's tail is sort of going down, it's either a village dog or it's a wolf. But if it's curled up like this one, then it's a wool dog. And an elder who has since passed away, he said that these are pens. So this is a puppy in a dog pen. Okay, next slide. Yeah. So oral history has always spoken of the woolly dog, and that's, you know, from one nation at the north all the way through down to the south. They all have stories about the woolly dog being important to them. And Deb Sparrow, some of her weavings are in the Vancouver International Arrivals area. She said that her grandfather, Ed Sparrow, who was born in 1898, watched his grandmother Spakria, Thaludkum's wife Cilicia, all working on these blankets. He said, I didn't know what they were doing at the time is getting me ready for my naming. And Deb said to him, oh, what was the wool made out of? He said, mountain goat. And these dogs they kept in pens. Then he tells me they took him to his great-grandfather's longhouse and they passed the name to him there, and they prepared him, and he wrapped them, and he was wrapped in the blanket that he had watched them make, and started the work of giving him his name. And he said it was never done again after that. And that's from Deborah Quasson Sparrow. She's a master weaver in Musqueam. And Rena Point told me that her great-grandmother, Fetsimia, probably had 10 to 15 dogs, little dogs. And when I interviewed her, she was 95 years old. Okay. And this is in the Burke Museum, the photograph, with all the Skokomish baskets. And you can see how most of them have dogs or wolves around the rim. Now, one of the things that I was concerned about, there was a major book done in 1980 called Salish Weaving, sort of like the Bible for the weavers of Coast Salish weaving. But it raised doubts, and that didn't raise all these doubts, but the author looked at most of the blankets around the world, and she said, I've looked at most of the blankets around the world, and I'm looking forward to seeing one made out of dog wool. Right, so that's a nice way of saying she hasn't seen any yet. But so there was doubts about where are all the blankets, like if they were made out of dog wool, where are they? There were doubts about the origin of the woolly dog. There was a lot of people that said they probably came from Japan or China, you know, shipwreck along the shore here. Maybe they came down from Alaska. And there was questions about how far back in time did the exotic dogs exist. Some people said, well, they probably came around 1800 or maybe in the 1750s. So there's questions about that. Paula Gustafson in her book questioned the spinnability of the hair, you know, that it was too slippery or too difficult using the traditional spindle. And if dog wool was used, then it was only used as a filler because you didn't have mountain goat. And there's also suggestions that the dog disappeared because of Hudson's Bay Company blankets. So with mass-produced blankets coming here, there was no need to have a dog anymore because it was cheaper to get a Hudson Bay blanket. You know, making a blanket would take at least a year, if not longer. But really, that ignores the cultural value of those blankets. So the Salish people themselves were saying, that doesn't sound right to us. You know, we have to find out more about that. And of course, where are all the blankets? So those are some of the things we wanted to look at in the scientific aspect of the research and also through the interviews. So there's Rena Bolton and Michael Pavel, who's Skokomish. He said that there was the big problem was disease. And his quote is, the most devastating was the scourge of the pandemics that swept our community. Once the people who took care of the dogs had passed away, it was difficult to take care of the dogs. And if you think about that, in some villages, 95% of the people were wiped out. So if you're one of the survivors, you're probably focused on surviving yourself. Who can take care of the herds of dogs? Because they eat a lot of fish every day. And Rena said everybody died from smallpox, except my great-grandmother, Mrs. Veeder. They were told they couldn't do their cultural things. There was the police, the Indian agent, and the priests. The dogs were not allowed. She, Rena's great-grandmother, had to get rid of the dogs, and so the family never ever saw them. So Rena explained that women of high status had the dogs. And there's a quote that you hear often, that you could tell a woman's wealth by the number of dogs she had. And she explained it a little bit differently. She said, you could tell the woman's wealth by the number of men she had in the household, because it took the men to go out fishing, bake the canoes, do all the work that was necessary in order to have the time to take care of the dogs. And because they were high status, having dogs was a dead giveaway that they were high status. And the Indian agents wanted everybody to be on equal status. So if you had dogs, you had to get rid of them because that got rid of the status or the viewpoint that the status. So what did we learn? So we looked, or Audrey and Logan looked at, they looked at the unique mutations for hair, because I said if it was kept, it was going to be kept because the hair was so important to spin. And in order to be spin, you don't want it thin and silky and slippery. You wanted it to be very grabby. And so they looked for mutations in hair, skin, keratin, and they were able to identify markers. So now we could go back to Susan Crockford's bones and look for those markers to see if her theory was right about the size, the formula that she had for distinguishing wool dogs from village or hunting dogs. They also found that it was ancient DNA that's not like any other breed. So a lot of people say, well, is it related to the Samoy? Because the Samoy looks similar, and the Samoy does look very similar to a wool dog, but doesn't have the same DNA. It's very different DNA. Mutton's DNA shows intense inbreeding. And they went back and they could tell that as a breed, the dog had to be kept separate from the hunting dog, because if it was bred with a hunting or village dog, the length of hair is a recessive gene, so the hair would start getting shorter, and it was very, very crimpy. So if it was bred with a local dog, it would lose that crimp and become silky and straight and slippery. They also found that Mutton's genetics showed about 15–16% of European dogs. So a great grandparent was European, but other than that, it's mostly this ancient DNA. And so that proves that if the dog has been kept separate for 2,000 to 5,000 years, that woolly dog definitely came from here. It didn't come from China, Japan, Tibet, other suggestions. It came from here. And it would take, if you wanted, people say, can you clone it? And Logan says, no, you can't. He said, we don't have a complete genome. There's some fragments that are missing. So we couldn't clone it. What you could do is you look for those unique mutations in other dogs, or look for the characteristics of what you're trying to create in the wool, and breed something that's similar, but you'll never, it took 4,000 years to get mutton's DNA. So it would take a long time to do that, but you might get something that's, well, Samoyed dogs, for example, you can spin their fur. Okay, and the next one. So this is a little bit of science here, but Zanka is going to help me, and she's creating nicer, easier, reader-friendly charts that'll make a bit more sense of this. But the one on the left is showing carbon and nitrogen. So carbon and nitrogen have different weights depending on well, I won't get into some of the science, but anyway, just they can put something through, they can take a piece of hair or a piece of bone and test it to see what somebody ate or a dog ate. And depending on the amounts of carbon and nitrogen, they can tell a few things. So, for example, with nitrogen, they could tell how high up or down the food chain what you ate. So, for example, with the marine life, if you eat krill, and then a shrimp would eat, bigger shrimp might eat krill or plankton, and then a fish will eat the shrimp, and then a bigger fish will eat the smaller fish, and then the seal might eat that fish, and goes on and up the food chain. So they can tell whereabouts in the food chain is the food that you typically eat. And with carbon, marine carbon's in the middle, but you can see that there's plants here that have low carbon, and that typically is plants that are grown in cooler, wetter climates. And at this end is carbon that are in plants that typically are grown in warmer, drier climates. So you can tell, where a person's been or an animal has been by how much carbon is in there. So that's what that one is looking at. And I should say, so for example, for warmer plants, that's like corn, or barley. So the difference between them is quite dramatic, and you can see it in the hair or bone. So this chart, this line, the green line, which looks blue, is the bone of the village dog. And the purple line down here is the bone of mutton. So you can see they're far apart. They ate different diets. The other thing that was interesting is Chris Stantis, who did the isotope analysis, she took the hair of the village dog, and it was much shorter than mutton's. And so that had a lot of implication, because that dog hair was probably a year's worth of growth. Right? But she could only get 5 3/4-inch samples from it. And with mutton, she could easily get 6 samples. So on the left is the oldest hair, which is the tip. And on the right is the root, the freshest, newest growth of hair. So she had 6 samples. So the oldest sample had lots of carbon. So it was eating some of this warm weather, warm climate food. And by the time that mutton died, it wasn't eating much of that at all. And so she emailed me, she says, what could mutton be eating? Could it be corn? Because corn doesn't grow in the Northwest. Well, there are actually areas where it was grown, but there were very small areas. And so I emailed one of my brothers, who was a historian, and he studied the Hudson's Bay Company fur trade. So I said, is it possible that the forts would sell corn? And he said, no, they sold salmon, they sold this, they sold that, but no corn. He said, if it was a US Army fort, they stocked it because it was part of the men's rations. They had to stock corn. And so with that in mind, I thought, well, where was mutton? Where was George Gibbs? It's at the time. So I think to put that on the next slide. So thank you to Zanka for making this much clearer and adding this. So so the A, B, C, D, E, F is where George was. We got that from journals that he or other people had written. So if you take mutton's hair and you assume that each 3/4 inch is probably a month's growth, roughly, then you could say, okay, well, we know that we're pretty sure he was dead by December 24th. Chris was also able to say he didn't have a chronic disease, so it was a sudden sickness that caused his death. And we also know that George wrote in his journal on December 24th that he didn't measure Mutton because Mutton had been sick. So we know Mutton was dead by December 24th. We know that it wasn't an intentional kill because Mutton had been sick. So he hadn't been expecting Mutton to be sick. If he had, he would have measured him, because to send a specimen to the Smithsonian, you wanted the specimen measurements while it was still alive or just recently dead, because they will shrink, especially the hide will shrink. And he hadn't measured. And so that's the only time we could find a writing that he's mentioned Mutton. So Mutton probably died pretty close to that date. So we can start with the root of the hair here and then work backwards. So we know that Gibbs was at Fort Colville. The other thing I found out reading somebody's journal was this guy that wrote his journal. He said, we got to Camp Cheecham, which is here, where the food supplies were resupplied. And he wrote something about how excited he was. They were having corn mush for breakfast. They were having corn in their meal at lunchtime. They were having molasses and corn pudding for dinner. So they were eating corn morning, noon, and night. And of course, George is probably feeding the dog what he ate. So there was lots of corn there. And then the same fellow wrote that by the time they got to Fort Colville, he was looking forward to having mush again. And he was very disappointed because they were all out of corn. They actually were out of a lot of food there, and they had scurvy over the winter. And so this is showing where they were, and you could see that the supplies of corn anyway were starting to run out. So Mutton ate a lot of corn, but also a lot of terrestrial, like deer or grouse. Whereas the village dog was consistent throughout his life that he was eating a marine-based food, which would have been salmon. Another little side aspect, because Andrew and I have talked a lot about this. When I mentioned to Tim Goder, he came and gave the talk about parasites. When I said that, they had eaten a lot of salmon, Tim said, well, how can that be? Because there's salmon sickness. And salmon sickness is due to bacteria, according to Tim. We'll have to talk about that a bit. The bacteria inside a parasite that gets into a snail, which gets into a fish, which gets into the dog. And the dog will die within 10 days. In most cases, if they survive, they've got immunity. But they called it salmon sickness. And one fellow wrote in the 1850s, he says, most European dogs die of salmon sickness, but for some reason, the indigenous dogs don't. And then I came across somebody else who had studied in Northern California and written down some of the things that the indigenous people there did. And what they did was when the dog was born, it would likely have some immunity from the mother's milk. And then as the puppies grew, they would give it a little bit of fresh salmon and dried salmon. And then as it got older and older, they would increase the amount of fresh salmon in their diet. So they building up immunity. So that was a really interesting thing to find out. But Mutton didn't have a lot of salmon. Okay, the other thing that we did was, this is Audrey here, and they're measuring with Missy, and this is Karen Carr, and Karen Carr is a scientific illustrator. So if you go to the Smithsonian and see the big murals of dinosaurs, Karen drew them. So she's got this great computer program that you can feed measurements so they took all these different measurements from the pelt, plus also I contacted Candace, who had rediscovered Mutton, because there was a skull in the same drawer, and she had taken all these pictures of this skull that we think is a wool dog skull, and she digitized them, and I then got them to Karen so she could put the skull into the computer program too. And they took all these measurements to figure out what the dog looked like. Okay, so the next one should show us. So this is what Karen Wood came up with. So this is it's very similar to what Susan Crockford back in the 90s, she had hired a forensic artist to do a wool dog. It's very similar. And I went through all the descriptions I could find in the last 150 years, and all the photographs, drawings, paintings, sketches, and they all correspond with that. Sharp, long fox-like face, the curled spitz tail, and the long hair, and a samoyed. This is a samoyed here. So Karen just put those in just to give you an idea of how big it is, because it looks quite big here, but it's only 18 inches high, and a samoyed here. So a samoyed is much bigger than mutton. Okay, and next slide. So then we put all this together, and it got published December 15th in Science. And this is a mock-up, so it wasn't. The Science asked us to put a cover together because they would choose from the stories in that issue which cover to use. They chose something with a fort. But I can't remember what the reason was, but it was the review of 2023, some of the top stories, and so you could have that fort represented. But that's what we had put together, sort of a Coast Salish blanket in the background and in the foreground. So it came out December 15th. But as a journalist, you can register with Science, and they'll send you the articles that are coming out in press release, and they have 6,000 journalists that are registered with them. So this went up to 6,000 journalists. So there was a lot of interest. So it's been in a lot. It's been in over 200 papers since. The Borneo Bulletin, the Costa Rica News. I mean, it's front page of the Washington Post, front page of the Seattle Times. So there's been a lot of interest in it. And the Science has a company that tracks all their articles, Altmetrics. And within 2 weeks, this article was in the top 5% of all journals they ever track, not just Science, but all the journals that they track. 5%. That doesn't mean it's good. I mean, it could be bad. Talk about quality. It's just the interest that's attractive. So when I had interviewed people and the advisory committee saying, how would you, aside from an academic article, how would you like the information shared? They had said, make it really accessible, audio if you can, visual, a book form, but make it not an academic book. So I mentioned that to Logan at the Smithsonian, and he happened to have gone to university with a fellow who's a filmmaker. He's a prof at Penn State. And remember the film Nanook of the North? Yeah. Okay, so that was the first official documentary, and that was done in 1924. And it's now 100 years later. So it just turns out that Kirk French, the documentarian, is right now as we speak is up north in that village, and he's been working with them for a couple of years to doing the sequel about Nanook of the North and what impact that documentary had on the community, and also what the climate change impact is. So Kirk was all keen to do this. So he came out in September, and we spent a week between Seattle and Vancouver and Chilliwack filming, and he was able to put an 8-minute teaser together, which we're using to try to raise some funds to do a fuller documentary. So he wants to come out again next spring, and we want to have at least a 20-minute documentary or 45-minute documentary done by spring of 2025. And also the Burke Museum has an exhibit coming in May of 2025. So we're trying to get all this lined up for that exhibit. And they're bringing back a lot of the blankets, textiles, regalia that was sent to the Field Museum in when was the World Fair? 1894, something like that, in Chicago. Anyway, whatever that year was, a lot of those objects are going to come back to the Burke Museum in May for that exhibit. Okay, so the next slide is the 8 minutes of the documentary.
The master plan from colonialism, as I'm sure you know and people are more aware of now, was to take the Indian out of the Indian. Yet I think we held on by a string. And to use that metaphor because I am a weaver.
weaving is a part of our identity. It's part of who we are as a people. When we were colonized, we were not allowed to keep our identity. We were not allowed to weave or to speak our language or to pass anything on to the future generations.
Upwards of 90% of the people perished, right, from diseases brought by Europeans. So a lot of knowledge was lost. A lot of society was lost. One of the casualties of colonialism was the woolly dog.
Well, I was born at Sumas Indian Reserve. I was 8 years old when the missionaries found me and I was taken to residential school. In order for me to carry on with the education of who I am, I was taken out away from the village, out to an old longhouse by the river. And that's where I learned to do all these things that I wasn't supposed to learn. My grandmother, she taught me how to spin with the spindle whorl when I was just a little girl. Her mother was a very important matriarch, and she used to have her own dogs.
The wool dog is a very important, untold aspect of our life and times. And one of the most important motifs that you'll see gracing the top rim of baskets, which we're really well known for, is the wool dog.
They were a little smaller but looked similar to a fox that each village had. And he said they had many, many, many of them. They would keep them they corral them and keep them in pens so they wouldn't interbreed with the wild animals.
These dogs were maintained only for one purpose, and it was to create the hair and the wool to make blankets or garments. These dogs were maintained just for that purpose and were fully sheared so that they could card it and spin it.
They were a big part of the community and, as I said, held in high regard and well taken care of.
It seems like there were only certain women who had these herds of dogs. My great-grandmother had them. By the time my grandmother started carrying on with the wool weaving in secret, the dogs were all gone because that was part of what we weren't allowed to have.
I was working on the biography of one of the husbands of the Indigenous women I was studying. So I went to Washington, D.C., to the Smithsonian's own archives, where I had photocopied 100 of his personal letters. In one of the letters, he said he'd sent back Mutton's Pelt, the pet dog of George Gibbs, the ethnologist on the boundary survey. He described putting the name, little tag on the dog Pelt's leg that said, "This is the dog whose hair the Indian women used to manufacture blankets." I inadvertently blundered into discovering the only known specimen that exists of the Coast Salish Woolly Dog, a pelt that is at the Smithsonian Institution and laid in a drawer for 160 years.
When we were able to look at the genomic DNA of mutton, we were kind of just trying to learn whatever we could about what makes this dog this dog. But with this, we'll be able to push back into the archaeological record, working with the community, and be able to learn a lot more about how these guys sort of came to be as they are. Sort of early academics had speculated that these things couldn't possibly be, and these weaving traditions couldn't have possibly developed here. And sure enough, what we could do is validate that, these dogs are North American native dogs. They look like they came from this area. And there's a very strong, very clear signal for that. Museums are places with histories that we have to reckon with. And the reality of the situation is also that science has sidelined the perspectives of the people who know the most about these phenomena. This is not a story about Smithsonian science. This is not our story. It is becoming clear to more and more folks in the museum world every day that there is no acceptable way to do this kind of work without having it be community-focused, community-centered, and collaborative.
There's this thread that's attached to us from the ancestors in the universe. No matter what they did, they couldn't conquer that. That to me is what's so valuable and important. It's not just about being a weaver, it's about a whole life. It's about who we are, and that's why this is so valuable to me and sacred to me, because it's who we are, and I'm honored to be part of it.
Through all of our lives, it's what kept us who we were, and we were thriving here, and colonialism happened and we got detoured, but I'm pretty sure we're on our way back.
This is a print that Elliot White Hill did a couple of years ago, showing a high status woman with a herd of dogs. So, hi. Some questions.
Very impressive to see the amount of investigating that you've done. That's just an amazing amount to research with all the nations, and it just warms my heart when I hear about the other nations that have knowledge of this and they're willing to share it. It's nice to see.
Thank you. One of the elders said that everybody's got a little piece of knowledge, and if you can put it all together, then it creates so much more. So, and everybody I interviewed and worked with was so willing to provide that knowledge, and so it wasn't work; it was a lot of fun. Yeah.
There was kind of an offhand remark from Logan Kessler that suggested if some people were uncertain about when weaving came to North America. Is that possible?
Yes, there was questions about that. I think it was written in I can't remember when it was written, in 1850 or a little bit later, but one guy questioned that the ability of people to weave. So he thought weaving must have come from Europe or someplace else. Everywhere around the world people wove. So why would you question that? I was really amazed about that. Yeah. Nancy.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much. I'm thinking of the drawing by Weber, who is with Vancouver, of a Newtown house with dogs that look a lot like that.
Well, I'll tell you another story. So I was doing research on it, and I came across a webpage. It's like the American Dog Association, something like that. And they talked about a Nootka dog, the Nootka Woolly Dog, which was collected in the 1840s, and 4 specimens were sent to the London Zoological Society. And they were going to be used for economic development for the Scottish people. And I thought, what did the Scottish people think dogs were? Anyway, I thought, where did this come from? I've never heard of this. So I emailed the American Dog Association and talked to the woman who wrote that page. And I said, can you remember where you got it from? And she couldn't. She said, I bet you I got it from Desmond Morris's book, 1,000 Dog Breeds Around the World. And Des Morris, in case you don't remember, but he became famous in the 60s, 70s for his book, The Naked Ape. But he also wrote about 1,000 dogs. And then she casually said, you know, he's still alive. I thought, he's still alive. And he said, well, she said, I'm not sure, but there's a web page and it seems to update information about him. And so I went and found the web page, and sure enough, it updates him. And I found out that he was a surrealist painter as well. And he painted with a lot of the famous French painters. I mean, this guy was amazing. Anyway, the web page looked like it was made in 1990, the early days of the internet, and had never been updated in terms of visuals since. And so I thought, I bet you it's a friend that made that web page for him. So I emailed the webmaster and I said, could you pass on this email to Des if you know him? And I got an email back the very next day from him. And I asked him about the Nootka dog, and I was researching the Coast Salish Woolly Dog. He was dismayed that he hadn't included the Woolly Dog in his book, but he had included the Flamin Woolly Dog, which is right across from Victoria. And so I explained to him that no, they're the one and the same thing. But I'd never heard anything about the Nootka dog. And he said, well, you know, it's 20 years since I wrote that book. He was 95. I've got a feeling he might not be around anymore because I emailed him last week and haven't heard since, and he's usually just right on it. Anyway, he said my archives at the University of Porto in Portugal, and it's COVID, you know, nobody can get there. And he said that, so you'll have to check with the London Zoological Society. And then I thought about that, and I had checked with them, and they couldn't find anything. And so I wrote him back. I said, well, if the dog dies, what are they going to do with him? Because they know the dog was unique. And he said, well, they would give him to the British Museum, the Natural History Museum, but I'd already gone through their database and it wasn't there. So I knew it wasn't there. He said, or the Tring Museum. And I thought, what the heck is the Tring Museum? I'd never heard of it. And he said, well, it's the private museum of Baron Rothschild. You know, the story gets more and more interesting. And it's in London, and it's now under the authority of the Natural History Museum. So I emailed Audrey and said, Audrey, we got to check this out. And Audrey had gotten her PhD from University of Oxford. From Gregor, she had worked under Gregor Larson, who was working with people all over the world to do with dog genetics. I'm sidetracking a little bit here, but it's interesting. And when I went to the Pitt Rivers Museum, which is in Oxford, I tried to meet with him, but he couldn't because he was going to Asia. But we emailed back and forth, and I explained about Mutton. This is in 2011. And he had never heard about Mutton. He says, sounds really interesting, but as far as I know, no one's doing any DNA analysis on North American dogs. And then Audrey does her PhD with him. Where am I going with this? The Nootka dog. Okay, so I emailed Audrey and said, Audrey, there may be a Nootka dog at the Tring Museum, and she was going to pick up her degree in 3 weeks, and she said, I'll make a trip out there and I'll go check. And then the next day she emails me back, and one of her fellow students who's looking at dog breeds, and dog breeds, really the idea of dog breeds just came out in the Victorian era and has changed dogs all over the world because of these rules and conformity. Anyway, one of his students was going there the very next day. And so he said he'd check it out. So sure enough, he found the skull of one of these dogs. It had been misclassified as an Eskimo dog. And so he's going to try and do some DNA on that. But that was from Nootka. And also Ian McKechnie thinks that he has dug up a wool dog on Keats Island in the Vulcan group. And he was part of this project too. So the wool dog wasn't just Coast Salish. That's the majority of the area that they were found, but the macaw, Nia Bay, had them on an island out there as well. And there's reports in the 1920s of them being up on Hope Island at the north end of the island. And I think what it is anybody that had a dog that had wool or hair, would have been kept, it'd be very important to the people. So there might be different types of wool dogs up and down the coast. Yeah. No more questions. Oh,
You didn't get into the diatomaceous earth.
the which?
The diatomaceous earth.
Oh, well, that's another story. But diatomaceous earth, which is plankton, little skeletons in the marine waters. And when the little creature dies, their external skeleton is still there, and they die and they fall to the bottom of the water. And in this area, under glaciers, it was glacial lakes. And so there was a lot of plankton and diatoms that died and built up layers. And the First Nations people around here would somehow figured out that if you collected that diatomaceous earth, once the glaciers were gone, that you could see it in the ground in some places, and they would burn it in a fire. I collected some, and I thought, well, this doesn't look like what I've read about it being white. And then I read that they burned it at a very high temperature, so I popped some into the wood stove, and it came out white. And that burnt off all the organic, so it was white. And then you could crumple it, and it felt like talcum powder, very soft, smooth. They would sprinkle that onto blankets, so they'd sprinkle it in with mountain goat wool or dog wool or feathers until they were cured. And what that would do was it would take the grease out, so it would make it whiter. It would make it easier to spin, like mountain goat's very kind of sticky and hard to spin, but it would make mountain goat wool easier to spin. And it's also a natural insecticide. And so it would keep out fleas, mice, etc. Not mice, fleas, lice, and other little insects too. And then they would refresh blankets with diatomaceous earth every couple of years as well. Emily, were there any questions on the chat?
So Liz, if there was no goats on that island, what other wool was used other than dog?
Well, there wasn't. And we're not sure about mountain goats on Vancouver Island because there was one found in a cave that was 10,000 years old up in Strathcona. But as far as we know, there weren't mountain goats. That could have been just an unusual case. We don't know. And on Olympic Peninsula, they actually imported them to the Olympic Peninsula. Now we're trying to get them out of there. So there wasn't any wool. So that's why the dog wool was so important. They would use stinging nettle and cedar and fireweed fluff and
cattail.
And which?
Cattail fluff.
And cattail fluff. To make textiles, but yeah, the dog wool was very important for that.
The dogs.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is
there any evidence of dog hair breeding in northern Russia?
There's evidence in other places around the world that dog wool was used, but there was also other animal fur, wool, hair that could be used. So it wasn't like this was definite husbandry for keeping that hair there. In other areas, there might have been only one dog breed anyway, and they would make things out of it. But it wasn't necessarily bred for the hair. It was a side product, another benefit from having dogs. Yeah. Yeah, Andrew.
What did you find out about the village dog that you mentioned?
Oh, the village dog. Yeah, so the village dog had a lot more European ancestry, so this was they were both collected close to 1859. So the fact that the village dog had a lot more European ancestry tells you how protected the wool dogs were, even after the coming of the Europeans. So they were still trying to hold on to that special qualities. What else did we find out from the village dog? The diet, salmon. I think those were the main things. The woolly dog had a few mutations that the village dog didn't have that were related to hair or keratin or or skin. And one of the mutations is the same mutation that the woolly mammoth has. Yeah. So that's interesting. So it's probably like a cold weather adaptation.
So the incidentally related dogs today to the woolly dog?
No, the ancient DNA is so old that there are no dogs with that ancient DNA. There might be remnants of the DNA, and that's what Audrey wants to do next. Is she wants to look at some dogs to see if there's any of that ancient DNA left. But the mutations that made it special seem to have disappeared. But you can't say that like the Malamute, not the Malamute, one of them, but the Samoyed looks so close to it, right? But that's a matter of breeding and not necessarily the DNA.
And they never interbreeded with the local dogs. Kept them separate.
They kept them separate until the 1860s. They started to die out.
Yeah. So to that point, so inbreeding did not seem to be an issue.
No, as a matter of fact, they looked at the inbreeding. Andrew, what do you call that? Would they look at the inbreeding in the DNA? The herosgazami. Yeah, that one. Which is basically looking at the amount of inbreeding and very little inbreeding. And the amount of inbreeding is actually similar to the New Guinea singing dog. Desmond Moore, another side. There's a story about this one too. He said when he was manager of the London Zoo, he was given by a famous conductor 2 New Guinea singing dogs. And somebody had given them as a gift to this conductor, and the conductor begged him to take them. No, he did. And his other friend, Spike Milligan, remember Spike Milligan? Spike Milligan came to hear them sing. And Spike listened very carefully. And he said to Desmond, he said, their Bach is much worse than their Beethoven. But it's just another case of dogs that were heavily inbred.
There's one question from the chat. Are there any original items that exist of these blankets or items that were made that the public can go and see?
Yes. Well, there's lots of Coast Salish blankets at the Royal BC Museum and at the Museum of Anthropology and at the Burke Museum in Seattle on the University of Washington campus. And the wool dog one, though, the best wool dog one is at the Burke Museum. So if you want to see that, then definitely go to the Burke Museum. Oh, and another project that we've got going is we want to bring Mutton back for a visit, and the Smithsonian's yeah, Smithsonian's quite happy about that. And so the idea would be Mutton would go to the Burke Museum to be there for the exhibit in May of 2025, and then go to either the Museum of Anthropology or the Royal BC Museum. But each of the museums is going to check first with their local community, because there might be protocols you have to follow, because some